My name is Dr. James Patterson, and I'm a quantum physicist specializing in consciousness effects in quantum mechanical systems. For the past 12 years, I've been working at the Institute for Advanced Physics at Princeton University, focusing on one of the most mind-bending aspects of quantum mechanics, the role of observation and consciousness in determining physical reality. I've published over 40 papers on quantum measurement theory, consciousness studies, and the intersection of physics and philosophy of mind. 9 months ago, in November 2024, I stumbled across something that completely revolutionized my understanding of both quantum mechanics and human history. What started as a routine investigation into anomalous results in consciousness-related quantum experiments led me to discover that ancient mystics and spiritual teachers understood the fundamental nature of quantum reality thousands of years before modern science even existed. The implications are so profound that they've changed everything I thought I knew about the relationship between mind, matter, and reality itself. I'm sharing this discovery because I believe it represents one of the most important realizations in the history of human knowledge, that ancient wisdom traditions weren't primitive superstitions, but sophisticated understandings of quantum mechanical principles that modern science is only now beginning to rediscover. It began with results that simply shouldn't have been possible according to conventional quantum theory. I was conducting experiments on the quantum measurement problem, specifically investigating whether conscious observation has measurable effects on quantum systems beyond the standard collapse of the wave function. We were using a modified double-slit apparatus where human observers could focus their attention on photons passing through the slits, measuring whether concentrated consciousness could influence the interference patterns. The conventional scientific view is that consciousness has no special role in quantum mechanics, that any interaction with a measuring device, conscious or not, causes wave function collapse. But our results were showing something extraordinary. Focused human attention was producing statistically significant changes in quantum behavior that couldn't be explained by any known physical mechanism. When experienced meditators participated in our experiments, the effects became even more pronounced. Subjects who had practiced meditation for over 10 years consistently produced quantum interference patterns that varied dramatically based on their state of consciousness. During deep meditative states, the wave-particle duality seemed to respond directly to their mental focus in ways that violated everything I'd been taught about the objective nature of physical reality. Have you ever had that moment as a scientist when your experimental data is telling you something that seems impossible, but the evidence is absolutely undeniable? That's exactly what happened when I realized we were measuring direct consciousness-matter interactions that mainstream physics said couldn't exist. But the real breakthrough came when I started researching historical descriptions of consciousness and reality to understand if anyone had ever reported similar phenomena. What I discovered absolutely blew my mind, because I found detailed descriptions of consciousness-reality interactions in ancient Buddhist, Hindu, and Taoist texts that perfectly matched what we were observing in our quantum experiments. The first connection I found was in the Buddhist concept of Maya, or illusion. According to Buddhist philosophy, which was developed over 2,500 years ago, what we perceive as solid, objective reality is actually a projection of consciousness. The Buddha taught that all phenomena exist in a state of interdependent origination. They have no inherent, independent existence, but arise only in relationship to observation and consciousness. This is essentially identical to the quantum mechanical principle of wave-particle duality and the measurement problem. In quantum mechanics, particles exist in superposition, multiple states simultaneously, until the moment of observation, when the wave function collapses into a single, definite state. The Buddha was describing this exact same phenomenon 25 centuries before we had the mathematical framework to understand it scientifically. But it gets even more specific. In the Madhyamaka philosophy developed by the Buddhist teacher Nagarjuna around 200 CE, there's a teaching called dependent origination that describes reality as a web of interconnected relationships with no fundamental, independent existence. Particles and phenomena arise only through their interactions with other phenomena, including conscious observation. When I read Nagarjuna's descriptions of reality as lacking inherent existence and existing only through interdependent relationships, I was essentially reading a philosophical description of quantum entanglement and non-locality. Modern quantum physics has proven that particles can be instantaneously connected across vast distances, that they exist in relationship rather than as independent objects, and that the act of measurement fundamentally creates the reality we observe. The precision of these ancient descriptions was absolutely fascinating from a scientific perspective. These weren't vague mystical metaphors. They were detailed analyses of the nature of consciousness and reality that anticipated some of the most counterintuitive discoveries of 20th century physics. The Hindu Vedantic tradition, which dates back over 3,000 years, contains even more specific descriptions of consciousness-reality interactions. The concept of Brahman, described as pure consciousness that underlies all of reality, matches remarkably well with what quantum physicists call the quantum field or quantum vacuum state. In Vedantic philosophy, individual consciousness, Atman, is described as fundamentally identical to universal consciousness, Brahman, and physical reality, Maya, is understood as a projection or manifestation of this consciousness. The Upanishads, ancient texts from around 800 BCE, contain detailed descriptions of how consciousness shapes and creates the appearance of physical reality through observation and attention. The most mind-blowing parallel I found was in the Mandukya Upanishad, which describes 4 states of consciousness: waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and a 4th state called Turiya. Turiya is described as pure awareness that observes but doesn't participate in the other 3 states. It's the consciousness that remains unchanged while observing all phenomena. This description is essentially identical to what quantum mechanics describes as the observer in the measurement problem. In quantum theory, there must be some aspect of the measuring system that remains classical, unchanging, in order to collapse the quantum wave function and create definite measurement results. The ancient sages were describing this exact same principle of conscious observation, creating definite reality from quantum possibilities. But what really convinced me that these weren't coincidences was when I found technical descriptions of consciousness-matter interactions in ancient Tibetan Buddhist texts that matched exactly what we were observing in our laboratory experiments. In Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, there's a teaching system called Dzogchen that describes different levels of consciousness and their effects on perceived reality. The highest level, called Rigpa, or pure awareness, is said to be capable of directly influencing physical phenomena through focused attention. The text describes specific meditation techniques for developing this awareness and practical instructions for using consciousness to affect material reality. When I compared these ancient instructions with our experimental protocols, the similarities were unmistakable. The Dzogchen teachings describe states of consciousness that produce what they call rainbow body phenomena, the ability to affect physical matter through pure awareness. Our meditation subjects were reporting similar experiences during the quantum experiments, describing states of expanded consciousness where they felt directly connected to the quantum systems they were observing. The Taoist tradition from ancient China contains similar descriptions. The Tao Te Ching, written around 600 BCE, describes reality as emerging from what it calls the Tao, an underlying field of potential that manifests into physical phenomena through observation and interaction. The text specifically mentions that the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao, which perfectly describes the quantum principle that particles have no definite properties until measured. Taoist alchemy texts from the Han Dynasty describe meditation techniques for achieving what they call Wu Wei, effortless action that works in harmony with the underlying field of reality. Practitioners reported the ability to influence physical events through consciousness alone, describing experiences that match exactly what we observe in consciousness quantum interaction experiments. But the most remarkable discovery came when I realized that these ancient traditions weren't just describing these phenomena. They had developed sophisticated practical techniques for reproducing them consistently. Unlike modern quantum physics, which can only observe these consciousness-reality interactions under controlled laboratory conditions, ancient practitioners had created training systems that allowed individuals to experience and utilize these effects directly. I decided to test this by incorporating traditional meditation techniques into our quantum experiments. We trained volunteer subjects in classical Buddhist mindfulness meditation, Vedantic self-inquiry practices, and Taoist awareness cultivation techniques. The results were extraordinary. Subjects who practiced these ancient methods showed dramatically enhanced ability to influence quantum systems through focused consciousness. When we monitored the brain activity of these experienced practitioners during quantum experiments, we found that their consciousness was affecting quantum systems in ways that correlated directly with specific neural patterns associated with deep meditative states. Ancient practices were literally training the brain to interface with quantum reality more effectively. The implications started becoming clear. Ancient spiritual traditions weren't just philosophical systems or religious beliefs. They were sophisticated technologies of consciousness, practical methods for accessing and utilizing the consciousness-reality interactions that quantum physics has only recently begun to understand scientifically. What's particularly fascinating is how accurate the ancient descriptions are of the technical details. Buddhist texts describe reality as consisting of what they call dharmas, momentary flashes of existence that arise and pass away billions of times per second. This is essentially identical to the quantum mechanical description of reality as consisting of discrete energy packets, quanta, that exist in probability waves until collapsed by measurement. The ancient teachers understood that consciousness and physical reality are not separate phenomena, but different aspects of a unified system. They developed detailed maps of consciousness states and their corresponding effects on perceived reality that match remarkably well with what we're discovering about quantum consciousness interactions. The more I researched, the more I realized that modern science is essentially rediscovering and validating insights that ancient contemplatives understood thousands of years ago. Recent neuroscience research on meditation has found that experienced practitioners show enhanced quantum coherence in brain microtubules, the cellular structures that some scientists believe are responsible for consciousness quantum interactions. Studies of Tibetan monks during deep meditation have found that their brains enter states of quantum coherence that allow for non-local information processing, essentially validating ancient claims about expanded consciousness and direct knowing. Advanced practitioners show neural patterns that suggest their consciousness is operating partially outside the constraints of classical physics. The Global Consciousness Project, which has been measuring correlations between human consciousness and random number generators worldwide for over 20 years, has found statistically significant evidence that collective human consciousness affects quantum mechanical systems on a global scale. During major world events that capture widespread attention, quantum random number generators around the world show non-random patterns that correlate with the intensity of collective focus. This validates ancient teachings about the collective nature of consciousness and its ability to influence physical reality. Hindu texts describe individual consciousness as waves on an ocean of universal consciousness, and Buddhist teachings emphasize the interdependent nature of all phenomena. Modern research is confirming that consciousness operates both individually and collectively to shape quantum reality. Recent developments in quantum computing have also provided unexpected validation of ancient consciousness principles. Quantum computers work by maintaining quantum superposition until measurement collapses the system into classical states, essentially using the same consciousness-reality interface that ancient practitioners described in their spiritual technologies. Some quantum computing researchers have found that human consciousness can influence quantum processor performance in ways that suggest direct mind-matter interaction. These effects are small but measurable, and they match exactly what ancient texts describe as the natural ability of trained consciousness to interface with subtle levels of reality. The field of quantum biology has discovered that many biological processes, including photosynthesis, bird navigation, and possibly even human cognition, operate through quantum mechanical principles. This suggests that consciousness quantum interactions aren't exotic laboratory phenomena, but fundamental aspects of how life itself operates. Ancient Ayurvedic and traditional Chinese medicine systems, which are thousands of years old, describe the human body as operating through subtle energy systems that interface between consciousness and physical matter. Modern quantum biology research is finding that these traditional descriptions of bioenergetic systems match remarkably well with quantum coherence patterns in living tissues. What's becoming clear is that ancient wisdom traditions understood something about the nature of consciousness and reality that modern materialist science lost track of during the mechanistic revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries. We've spent 300 years developing increasingly sophisticated ways to study physical matter while ignoring consciousness, only to discover that consciousness and matter are inseparably connected at the quantum level. The research implications are staggering. If consciousness directly affects quantum reality in measurable ways, then the ancient spiritual practices for training consciousness aren't just personal development tools. They're technologies for interfacing with the fundamental nature of physical reality. I've been collaborating with neuroscientists studying advanced meditation practitioners, and we're finding that traditional spiritual training produces specific neurological changes that enhance quantum consciousness interactions. Experienced meditators show increased gamma wave coherence, enhanced connectivity between brain regions, and neural patterns that suggest expanded processing beyond classical computational limits. These findings validate ancient claims that spiritual practice develops what Buddhist texts call abhijna, enhanced perceptual abilities that include direct knowing and influence over physical phenomena. Modern science is confirming that these aren't supernatural claims, but descriptions of natural consciousness capabilities that can be developed through proper training. The implications for human potential are extraordinary. If ancient practitioners were correct that consciousness fundamentally shapes reality through quantum interactions, then developing consciousness becomes the most practical technology for effecting positive change in the world. Ancient spiritual practices weren't escapist mysticism. They were sophisticated methods for accessing and utilizing the consciousness-reality interface that quantum physics has discovered. Recent studies of prayer and intention effects have found measurable impacts on everything from plant growth to healing rates to quantum random number generators. These effects match ancient descriptions of consciousness-based influence over physical phenomena, suggesting that traditional spiritual practices were actually practical technologies for consciousness-reality interaction. The Global Coherence Initiative has found that human heart rhythm patterns, especially during states of appreciation and compassion, create measurable electromagnetic fields that affect not only other people but also quantum systems in the environment. This validates ancient teachings about the power of positive emotional states to influence reality and creates a scientific foundation for understanding how individual consciousness training benefits collective well-being. What's particularly fascinating is how the ancient understanding was often more sophisticated than our current scientific models. Buddhist psychology describes over 50 different types of consciousness and their interactions with various levels of reality. Hindu Tantra maps dozens of different energy centers and consciousness states. Taoist internal alchemy describes complex interactions between consciousness, energy, and matter that we're only beginning to understand scientifically. These traditions understood that consciousness isn't a single phenomenon, but a complex spectrum of awareness states, each with different capabilities for interfacing with quantum reality. Modern neuroscience is confirming this complexity, finding that different types of meditation and consciousness practices produce distinct neural patterns and enhanced quantum coherence in different brain regions. The ancient teachers also understood something that modern science is just discovering: that consciousness development isn't just individually beneficial, but is essential for collective human evolution. They taught that as more individuals develop expanded consciousness capabilities, the collective field of human awareness becomes more coherent and capable of positive influence on global reality. The more I study both ancient wisdom and quantum consciousness research, the more I realize we're at a crucial point in human development. Ancient traditions preserved sophisticated understanding of consciousness-reality interactions for thousands of years, waiting for human knowledge to develop enough to validate and integrate their insights scientifically. We now have the scientific tools to measure and understand phenomena that ancient practitioners could only describe through metaphor and spiritual language. At the same time, we're discovering that modern technological civilization has created global challenges that require exactly the kind of consciousness development that ancient traditions specialized in cultivating. Climate change, environmental destruction, social inequality, and technological risks all stem from consciousness patterns that prioritize short-term material gain over long-term collective well-being. Ancient wisdom traditions understood that external reality reflects internal consciousness states, and they developed comprehensive methods for transforming consciousness patterns that create suffering and conflict. If quantum mechanics is correct that consciousness fundamentally shapes reality, then the ancient approach of focusing on consciousness development becomes the most practical strategy for addressing global challenges. Instead of trying to solve problems purely through external manipulation of matter and energy, we can address the consciousness patterns that create those problems in the first place. The implications for human potential are mind-blowing. Ancient texts describe advanced practitioners achieving what they call siddhi, consciousness abilities that include direct influence over physical matter, access to non-local information, and perception beyond the limits of ordinary sensory experience. Modern quantum consciousness research suggests these descriptions might be accurate accounts of natural consciousness capabilities. Recent studies of exceptional individuals, advanced meditators, mystical experiencers, and consciousness researchers have found evidence for quantum consciousness effects that exceed what current scientific models predict as possible. These findings suggest that human consciousness capabilities extend far beyond what mainstream neuroscience assumes, matching ancient claims about the extraordinary potential of trained awareness. What's becoming clear is that we're not just rediscovering ancient knowledge, we're integrating ancient wisdom with modern scientific understanding to create possibilities that neither tradition could achieve alone. Ancient practices provide sophisticated methods for consciousness development, while modern science provides measurement tools and theoretical frameworks for understanding and optimizing these practices. The future implications are extraordinary. If we can combine ancient consciousness technologies with modern scientific understanding, we could develop educational systems that train both intellectual knowledge and consciousness capabilities. We could create healing approaches that address both physical symptoms and the consciousness patterns that create illness. We could develop decision-making systems that integrate rational analysis with the expanded awareness that comes from consciousness development. Most importantly, we could address global challenges through consciousness approaches that ancient traditions understood were more effective than purely external interventions. If consciousness shapes reality through quantum interactions, then transforming human consciousness becomes the most powerful technology for creating positive change in the world. I keep thinking about how the ancient teachers understood something profound that we're only now beginning to appreciate scientifically. They realized that the apparent separation between consciousness and physical reality is an illusion created by limited awareness. They developed sophisticated practices for expanding awareness beyond this limitation and accessing the consciousness reality interface that quantum physics has now discovered. What do you think about these connections between ancient wisdom and quantum consciousness research? Have you noticed any correlation between your own states of consciousness and the events or circumstances you experience in physical reality? Because once you understand that consciousness and matter are interconnected at the quantum level, you start noticing patterns that suggest your inner awareness might be influencing your external experience in ways that ancient traditions understood, but modern culture has largely forgotten. The ancient mystics weren't primitive predecessors to modern science. They were sophisticated explorers of consciousness who understood aspects of reality that we're only now rediscovering through quantum physics. Their insights suggest that the future of human development lies not in choosing between spiritual wisdom and scientific knowledge, but in integrating both approaches to understand the consciousness reality interface that connects ancient wisdom with quantum mechanical principles. We're living at a time when ancient spiritual technologies and modern scientific understanding can finally be combined to access human potential that neither tradition could fully develop alone. The consciousness code that connects quantum mechanics with ancient mysticism isn't just an interesting intellectual discovery. It's a practical roadmap for human evolution that could transform both individual experience and collective reality in ways that honor both the precision of modern science and the wisdom of ancient spiritual understanding.